Different people are drawn to different stories, but sometimes the stories they avoid have a lot to say to them. Whenever I preach on a particular text, I'm always curious how it is used and understood by various religious groups in society. So I will conduct a search on the web to determine which types of ministers are most likely to select that text and what they have to say about it. What I found in this case was that about 90% of sermons about the woman accused of adultery are given by conservative ministers. And the reason they select this text is because they are worried it might give the false impression that Jesus condoned adultery. And so they go to great lengths to argue the opposite, that Jesus was adamantly against adultery, and that the reason why Jesus was merciful to this woman was because, in their words, he loved the sinner but hated the sin. The other 10% of sermons on this story are by more moderate ministers. They use it to suggest that we should not judge others, that we all make mistakes, and therefore we all need to learn to just get along. And so the vast majority of sermons on the woman accused of adultery are given in conservative churches, a small minority in more moderate ones, and virtually none in progressive churches like those in the UCC. Now, Lee preached on this text a few weeks ago, but his sermon is the exception that proves the rule that progressive churches tend to avoid this text, which is partly understandable. After all, unlike conservatives, we do not go around acting like morality police, accusing others of being sinful. And unlike moderates, we think justice is more important than politeness. And therefore, we come to the defense of groups that are subject to intimidation and targets of violence. Neither are we like those self-righteous scribes and Pharisees who judge and demonize others. Nor are we like the bystanders of this story, who would allow someone to be ridiculed and threatened to be killed. In short, this is not a story that seems to apply to us. We are opposed to witch hunts. Then again, it was our ancestors, the Puritans, who brought the practice of witch hunts to this country. They came from Europe, where 40,000 to 60,000 people were put to death for witchcraft, to colonial Massachusetts, where they sought to establish their vision of God's kingdom on earth by purging and hanging those thought to be influenced by evil spirits in the infamous Salem witch trials. Indeed, many of the contemporary forms of witch hunts and scapegoating in America have their origins in our faith tradition. And so rather than dismissing the story about the woman accused of adultery as not applying to us, it might be worth reflecting on its possible relevance to religious progressives like ourselves. So what is a witch hunt? Conventional wisdom suggests that these events are the products of mass hysteria, when religious extremists randomly accuse persons of being possessed by demons, and thus deserving of being put to death, whether by burning, hanging, drowning, or some other means. However, research on witch hunts suggests that often something more is going on. These moral panics frequently occur during crises and other troubled times when the interests of elite groups are being threatened. And in an effort to preserve their privileges, these groups will single out relatively powerless actors as a danger to the established order and society's core values. Elites, in effect, will try to mobilize the masses by weaponizing their values and suggesting to them that they are more committed than their opponents to ridding communities of deviance. You can see this dynamic at work throughout U.S. history. More privileged groups have sought to protect their status and further their political agendas by casting certain groups as boogeymen, from Catholics at the turn of the 20th century and Japanese Americans during World War II, to Muslims in the wake of 9/11, and gay and transgender people today. Conservative leaders have been especially prone to scapegoating, but their liberal counterparts have occasionally resorted to this tactic as well, such as when they have stereotyped supporters of conservative causes as deplorables and bitter people who cling to their guns and religion. In fact, as our society grows more polarized and our political elections more contested, Democrats and Republicans have both tried to galvanize their constituents by suggesting certain groups threaten their values. Some going so far as to try to get the other party's most extreme candidates nominated in primary elections because they believe it would be easier to create or to beat such crazies in the general election. Understood against this backdrop of witch hunts and scapegoating, the deeper lesson of the scripture lesson becomes clear. Jesus lived during a time when there were rising tensions in Judea between Jews and their rulers, the Romans, over matters like taxation. At the same time there was political unrest, there were growing divisions within the Jewish community itself over moral issues, such as whether healing should be allowed on the Sabbath, how the Sabbath should be observed, and about purity laws, ranging from how to wash one's hands to whether certain foods were unclean. Jesus exacerbated these tensions by not aligning with any of the Jewish sects of his day and interpreting Jewish laws according to a new set of rules, suggesting, for example, that all food was good. In these and other ways, Jesus posed a threat to the religious leaders of his time, many of whom enjoyed a lavish lifestyle supported by the temple tax and benefited from colluding with Roman rulers. And so, to discredit Jesus and his followers, scribes and Pharisees, who were knowledgeable about Jewish law and tradition, set a trap for Jesus. They brought before Jesus a scapegoat, a woman allegedly caught in adultery, someone nobody in the Jewish community would stand up and defend, and asked Jesus whether she should be put to death as prescribed by Jewish law. That they were more interested in weaponizing Jewish values than being true to their spirit is evident in the fact that under Jewish law, both the man and woman who committed adultery were supposed to be put to death. Here, however, only the less powerful of the two, the woman, was threatened with being killed by stoning. Jesus' response to this woman's accusers is very interesting. Instead of engaging their question about whether the woman should be killed, he just doodles in the sand. Obviously, he sees through their hypocrisy and realizes the group's true motive, not to protect the value of marital fidelity, which Jesus also shared, but to preserve these religious leaders' rights and privileges by demonstrating to others that they represented the true Israel, that they and they alone were willing to do whatever it took to uphold the greatness and exceptional status of God's people. Today, there is a dynamic at work in America, similar to the one that Jesus faced. For the past 2 decades, there has been a great deal of unrest in our society, as many people perceive that their futures, their relationships, and especially their core values are at risk. And as competition between our 2 major political parties for the votes of these individuals has intensified, both parties have increasingly resorted to scapegoating to prove to voters that they are the ones most committed to defending Americans' values. We see this most obviously among conservatives, who blame our nation's problems on a variety of groups, ranging from immigrants and gays to atheists and woke youth. But scapegoating has become common among liberals as well, who have found easy targets in working-class whites, white evangelicals, pro-lifers, anti-vaxxers, rural voters, climate deniers, and election deniers, all of whom tend to be poorer and less educated than the average citizen, and therefore are ridiculed by liberals as stupid and backward people who pose a threat to our democracy, religious freedom, and the survival of our planet. While both parties rarely go so far as to say their scapegoats are deserving to be put to death, they often do the next worst thing, which is to treat them as moral degenerates and outcasts. In the Midwest, where I grew up and served as a student pastor, generations of white working class whites labored in factories, generating huge amounts of revenue for their companies, having been taught that what is good for business is good for America, only to have owners close their factories and take the revenues workers created and reinvest them in industries located elsewhere, leaving devastated communities in their wake. It's little wonder then that many of these workers and their families are drawn to anti-establishment figures like Trump and a Christian nationalist movement because they feel betrayed. They feel left behind. But instead of being encouraged to understand their plight, those of us on the left are frequently told to fear such people as menaces to society. Indeed, the longer you listen to such rhetoric, you cannot help but get angry and want to throw stones at these allegedly irredeemable people. So what are we to do? What are we to do? Well, Jesus makes it pretty clear what we should do. Instead of harming the woman accused of adultery or shaming her further, he told her she was free to leave. In effect, Jesus was offering her the opportunity to begin a new life. Whether she took up that opportunity, we're not told. But that at least was the merciful gift that Jesus held out to her. Can we follow his example and show the same type of mercy? Let's find out. Let's find out. I'd like us to think about the scapegoats of the left and how we respond to them. Imagine that these marshmallows are stones. In our polarized society, there are plenty of stones to go around. Stones aplenty. All right. Well, as I suggested, one of the scapegoats of the left is the person who denies the reality of climate change. Okay? Who here could play the part of a climate denier? Anyone? I don't know why, Scott, but everyone seems to be looking in your direction. I don't know why that is, but would you mind volunteering and coming forward? Stand here and face the crowd.
The climate's always changing.
The climate denier. You know, I have a lot of problems with your outlook. You refuse to acknowledge the science showing the burning of fossil fuels not only imperils the most vulnerable people in our world, but the Earth's life support system itself. You put your self-interest before the survival of others and the planet. I'm horrified by your selfishness and refusal to accept the facts. I suspect many here today feel the same way. And so I invite any of you who have never put your self-interest before others and have always acted on the basis of reason to throw a stone at this individual. Anyone? No? Well, they apparently do not feel qualified to punish you, and neither do I. Go and make the best of the opportunities you have to make this a world where every living creature can flourish. Thank you. Another scapegoat that I mentioned is the election denier. Who here could play the part of an election denier? Scott, I'm going to let you choose somebody for me, okay? You were so nice to come up forward. You get the privilege of choosing somebody. No, not you again. You choose somebody out there. Yeah, who'd be?
Alice.
Alice. Alice, would you mind coming forward? Would you come forward and play the part of an election denier? If you would, stand to my right. Thanks for playing along. And you can get back at Scott later on. Yeah. Okay? The election denier. You know, I'd be the first to admit that our democracy is not perfect.
It's not.
But when you and others refuse to accept the outcome of any election that does not go your way and attack it as fraudulent, you threaten the possibility of ever creating a political system that represents the will of the people. You pave the path for authoritarians to rule over us. And that makes me angry, as I suspect it does many here also. And so I would invite any of you who has never questioned the legitimacy of an elected official, who has never thought an election was unfairly won by the opposite party, to hurl a stone at this election denier. Anyone here? Well, they apparently think more could be done to create a democratic society. What's that?
Do I really throw it at somebody?
No, you just hold it in your hand there. No, I'm asking if they're willing to throw it at you. Just keep it in your hand there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, apparently here, nobody here thinks that everything has been done to create a democratic society, and I feel the same way. So go and make the best of the opportunities you have to create a society governed by the people and for the people. Thank you. All right. Now, a final scapegoat of the left that I mentioned and would like to address is the white evangelical. Who here could play the part of a righteous, God-fearing white evangelical? Anyone? Anyone? Thank you for volunteering. You have a good sense of humor. Thank you. You know, I have to say that of all the scapegoats of the left, this one makes me perhaps the angriest. In my mind, you, and especially your leaders, have not only lied about who Jesus is and stood for, but you have allowed the Christian faith to be hijacked by individuals and groups whose lust for power knows no end. It may take decades just to begin to undo the damage you have done to our faith tradition in suggesting that God puts America first, in siding with people who use symbols like the cross to promote hate and racism and to justify violent insurrections. Christianity may never recover from what you and other white evangelicals have done. Again, I turn to you, members of Wash Park United Church of Christ, and ask who among you feels qualified to throw a stone at this individual. Is there anyone here who has not betrayed our faith, who has not looked the other way when our religious symbols have been co-opted for political gain, who has always revered the image of God in everyone, including strangers? If so, grab a marshmallow or two and toss them at this character. Regrettably, there are no perfect Christians in this progressive church either. And so, go. And may we both do a better job at representing the faith tradition we claim as our own. The point of this sermon is not to deny the harm done by the climate denier and so forth, nor is it suggesting that people who promote violence and intolerance should not be brought to justice, including a past president who falsely suggests that any criticism of him constitutes a witch hunt. These individuals should and must be held accountable for their actions. Rather, the point of this sermon is that in responding to the real scapegoats of society, we need to make sure that our actions are truly guided by the values that we profess, and that our values are not used as a cover to justify and defend our privileges. This is a real challenge for those of us on the left, because the political party most of us align with, the Democratic Party, has in many ways become the party of the privileged. Today, for example, Democrats represent 24 of the 25 most affluent districts in this country. And the median household income in districts represented by Democrats is more than $10,000 more than the median for districts represented by Republicans. In these and other ways, Democrats are not too different than the privileged religious elite of Jesus' day. And it is precisely because we have more to lose that we often struggle to live out our values. For example, in blue cities and neighborhoods like this one, you will see lots of signs in front yards claiming residents welcome people of all color, of all beliefs, and so forth. But when it comes to passing policies that would make those cities and neighborhoods affordable for such groups to live in, it's a different story. Residents in these democratic strongholds often oppose any affordable housing project that might compromise their property's values. Likewise, the residents of wealthy liberal areas are careful to draw the boundaries of school districts in ways that ensure the taxes they pay for public education are spent within their neighborhoods, creating huge disparities in educational opportunities for children living in rich and poor neighborhoods. In these and other ways, otherwise well-meaning citizens have hoarded resources they claim to want to make available to others. And yet, as our society becomes more divided, those of us on the left still try to convince ourselves and others that we are more virtuous than those on the right. We become blind to the ways that we are falling short despite our good intentions, how our desire to see ourselves as good can undermine our ability to actually do good, and how we have been complicit in keeping many of today's scapegoats in their vulnerable and disadvantaged situations, in much the same way the scribes and Pharisees failed to acknowledge how they rendered women and others easy targets for scapegoating. And so, rather than trying to heal the divisions in our society by issuing yet another call for unity, we might have better luck if we first put down our stones and admit how we have failed to live out our values. For only then might we experience and exhibit the kind of divine mercy needed to create a new and better life for all. Let us pray. Dear God, we are grateful for family and friends who have supported us along life's journey, those who have affirmed our sacred worth despite our many shortcomings. We ask that you give us the humility to extend that same mercy to others who stand in our path and oppose us. May we put aside our resentments so that we might both realize the new beginnings that you offer us. Amen.